People keep asking why Angel, Reese, and I get treated so differently. At first, I didn't even notice it. I was too focused on playing, on adjusting, on surviving the speed of this league. But over time, it became impossible to ignore. Same games, same spotlight, same mistakes, same confidence. Yet the reactions were never the same. What surprised me wasn't criticism. Every player gets that. What surprised me was the tone, the labels, the stories people decided to tell about us before either of us ever spoke. I would read headlines and feel like they were talking about a version of me I didn't fully recognize. Then I'd see reactions to Angel and realize how differently the same behavior could be framed depending on who you are. I remember sitting back and thinking, how did we become symbols instead of just players? How did confidence turn to classy in one conversation and attitude in another? We weren't doing anything dramatically different. We were competing, we were expressing ourselves, we were trying to win. Yet the way it was received felt worlds apart. This isn't about pointing fingers, and it's not about saying one of us has it easier. It's about acknowledging something real that fans don't always want to talk about, that perception shapes pressure, that narratives stick, and that once people decide who you represent, everything you do gets filtered through that decision. Angel, Reese, and I didn't choose to be compared like this, but the league, the media, and the fans turned us into mirrors of a larger conversation, one that goes far beyond basketball. And understanding that was one of the most eye-opening moments of my career, because once you realize you're being treated differently, the real question becomes, how do you carry that without letting it change who you are? Once I became aware of it, I couldn't unsee it. The reactions followed us everywhere. A celebration here became confidence. The same celebration there became controversy. Silence in one moment was called professionalism. Silence in another moment was called arrogance. And slowly, I realized this wasn't really about basketball decisions anymore. It was about expectations people carried with them before we ever stepped on the court. Angel Reese plays with emotion. I play with control. Neither of those approaches is right or wrong. They're just different, but difference gets interpreted in ways that aren't always fair. The same intensity that makes one player passionate can make another problematic. And that double standard doesn't come from what happens in the game. It comes from what people are comfortable seeing. What made it more complicated was that none of this was ever said directly to us. It lived in headlines, comments, debates, and viral clips. You'd feel it in how questions were asked, in what moments were replayed over and over, in which mistakes were forgiven quickly, and which ones were held on to. And carrying that kind of invisible weight is exhausting because you're constantly reacting to something no one fully admits exists. I also started noticing how fans chose sides without understanding either of us. They weren't always supporting players, they were defending ideas. One of us became a symbol of calm dominance, the other became a symbol of unapologetic fire. And once you're placed into a box like that, everything you do gets interpreted through it, whether you want it to or not. This was the moment I understood something important. Angel and I weren't just competing on the court anymore. We were being compared to it in conversations we didn't control. And while rivalry can be healthy, narratives can be heavy, because when people stop seeing you as an athlete and start seeing you as a statement, the pressure changes completely. And that's when I started asking myself a harder question. Not why the treatment was different, but how long can you carry other people as expectations before it starts shaping your own behavior? At some point, the difference in treatment stopped being something I just noticed and started being something I felt. Not in anger, not in resentment, but in awareness. I became more conscious of how every reaction might be interpreted, how every moment could be framed. It wasn't that I wanted to change who I was. It was that I started realizing how little room there was to simply exist without being analyzed. I wondered if Angel felt the same weight, just in a different direction. Because while my actions were often softened or protected by certain narratives, hers were sharpened and questioned, and neither of those positions is comfortable. Being constantly defended can feel just as limiting as being constantly challenged. In both cases, you're no longer just playing the game. You're performing inside someone else's story. What bothered me most wasn't the comparison between us, it was the assumption that there had to be a right way to be, that confidence needed to look a certain way to be accepted, that emotion had to be expressed within invisible boundaries, and once those boundaries were crossed, the conversation changed. Not about basketball anymore, but about character. I started realizing how easy it is for public perception to flatten people into one-dimensional versions of themselves. Angel became the fire, I became the face, but neither of those labels captured the full reality. They ignored the work, the pressure, the discipline, and the vulnerability that both of us carry. And when people forget that, they stop listening. They start judging. This was the part that stayed with me, not because it hurt the most, but because it revealed something deeper about how athletes are seen, especially women who don't fit neatly into one box. The treatment wasn't just different, it was telling. And understanding that made me more careful, not quieter, more intentional, not smaller. Because once you realize the game isn't just being played on the court, you have to decide how you'll show up when. The rules aren't written down. That's when I started understanding that this wasn't really about me and Angel as individuals. It was about the system around us, the way stories are built, the way moments are selected, the way narratives are repeated until they feel like truth. Neither of us asked to become symbols. But once the spotlight decides you represent something, it's hard to step out of that role. I noticed how quickly one moment could define weeks of conversation. A look, a reaction, a quote taken out of context. And once that happens, everything else you do is filtered through that. Single image for Angel, emotion became the headline. For me, calm became the expectation. And expectations are dangerous because once people decide who you are, they stop allowing you to be anything else. What made this even more complicated was realizing how much of it was unintentional. Most fans weren't trying to be unfair, most media voices weren't trying to create division, but repetition creates impact, whether it's intentional or not. And when the same contrast is shown again and again, it trains people to see difference as opposition instead of diversity. I also began to understand how pressure grows differently, depending on how you're framed. When you're constantly questioned, you feel the need to prove yourself over and over. When you're constantly praised, you feel the fear of disappointing. Both are heavy. Both can shape how you move, how you speak, and how freely you express yourself. And neither has much to do with basketball anymore. This was the moment I stopped seeing the conversation as me versus Angel. That framing was too simple, too lazy. The real issue was how easily the league, the media, and the audience fall into patterns that turn athletes into opposites instead of individuals. And once that happens, it becomes harder to appreciate the game for what it truly is. Competition between equals, not characters in a storyline. Understanding that didn't make things quieter, but it made them clearer. And clarity at this level is the only way to stay grounded without losing yourself in someone else's narrative. Once I understood that the system around us played a role, I had to face a harder truth. Even when you know the narrative isn't fully fair, it still affects you. You start second-guessing moments that should be instinctive, and you become more aware of how things might look instead of how they feel. And that awareness slowly changes how freely you move, even when no one is telling you to change. I notice it in small ways, pausing before reacting, choosing restraint when emotion felt natural, not because I didn't want to express myself, but because I understood how quickly expression could be interpreted. That kind of self-editing doesn't come from fear, it comes from responsibility. But carrying responsibility all the time can be exhausting, especially when you didn't ask to be placed in that role. I also realized that Angel and I were both adjusting just in opposite directions, where I felt pressure to remain composed. She carried the pressure of being constantly questioned. And neither path is easy. One asks you to never slip. The other asks you to constantly defend yourself. From the outside, people argue about who has it harder. From the inside, both feel heavy in different ways. This is where the conversation usually gets oversimplified. Fans want heroes and villains, calm versus fire, class versus attitude, but real people don't live in those extremes. We have good days and bad ones, confident moments and uncertain ones, and when the world insists on seeing you one way, it takes effort to protect the parts of yourself that don't fit that image. That effort taught me something important. You can control how you're framed, but you can control whether you let that framing define you. And the moment you start playing to meet expectations instead of playing to be honest, you lose something essential. And at this level, losing that connection to yourself is more dangerous than any criticism. By this point, the question wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about choice. Do you let the difference in treatment shape who you become, or do you learn how to stand steady inside it? Over time, I realized that the most important battle wasn't about how Angel Reese was treated compared to me. It was about how I responded to being placed inside someone else's narrative. The moment you let outside voices decide who you are, you stop growing on your own terms. And at this level, losing that control can quietly cost you more than any bad game ever could. I learned to separate noise from truth. Noise comes from opinions, headlines, and comparisons that change every week. Truth comes from the work you put in, the people who actually know you, and the way you show up when no one is watching. Once I anchored myself in that, the difference in treatment stopped feeling personal. It felt structural. And understanding that difference matters, because structural things can be observed without being absorbed. I also started respecting Angel in a different way, not as a rival defined by contrast, but as someone navigating her own version of pressure under a harsher lens. Competing doesn't require misunderstanding each other, and respect doesn't mean agreement. It means recognizing that different paths can exist in the same space without one being more valid than the other. What surprised me most was how much this experience taught me about resilience. Not the loud kind that shows up in highlight reels, but the quiet kind that shows up in restraint, in choosing not to react, in staying focused when distractions are designed to pull you apart. That kind of resilience isn't taught in practice. It's learned through moments like this. By this stage, I wasn't trying to change the conversation anymore. I was trying to outgrow it, because conversations move on, but character stays. And the strongest response to being treated differently isn't to you proving people wrong, it's staying grounded enough that their expectations stop mattering. And once you reach that point, the difference in treatment loses its power. Looking back now, I understand that the difference in how Angel Reese and I are treated says more about the world around us than it does about either of us. It reflects how quickly people try to simplify complex individuals into easy stories, how competition turns into comparison, and how narratives can grow louder than reality if you're not careful. Angel and I are two competitors in the same league, chasing the same goal in very different ways. Neither path is right or wrong, they're just different, and difference shouldn't automatically mean division. When fans, media, and even the league allow that division to grow unchecked, it takes attention away from what actually matters: the game, the work, and the respect every player earns through effort. What this experience taught me most is that you don't need to explain yourself to every conversation you didn't create. Sometimes the strongest response is consistency, showing up, competing, letting your actions speak when. Words would only add fuel. That doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means refusing to be consumed by it. If you're watching this and you've ever felt judged differently for simply being yourself, this isn't just a sports story. It's a reminder that perception isn't truth, and labels don't undefine your worth. You're allowed to exist outside of other people's expectations. You're allowed to grow without choosing a side. Different treatment doesn't mean different value, and competition doesn't require conflict. If you want more honest conversations about the realities behind professional sports, the parts that don't always fit into headlines, stay here, subscribe. We'll keep talking about what really matters without turning people into characters.